Imagine an army you could fit inside a modern-day university lecture hall. 500 men. They were not the elite soldiers of a great empire. They were its outcasts. Gamblers, debtors, minor nobles with no inheritance, and killers, all seeking a final, desperate chance at a fortune they could never hope to attain back home. Now, imagine what they decided to conquer. Not a city, not a kingdom, but an entire world. An empire of over 10 million people, with a standing army numbering in the hundreds of thousands. An empire of gold and blood, ruled by a god-king from a floating city more spectacular than Venice, a metropolis of pyramids and canals nestled in the heart of a vast lake. By any rational calculation, what happened next should have been impossible. It is a story that sounds more like a fever dream or a dark fantasy epic than a chapter of our own history. It is the story of how 500 desperate men, armed with steel, gunpowder, and an almost suicidal level of self-belief, toppled one of the most powerful and sophisticated civilizations on Earth. This is the story of two men, two leaders from opposite sides of history, destined to collide. One was Hernán Cortés, a brilliant, charismatic, and utterly ruthless gambler, playing for the highest stakes imaginable. The other was Moctezuma II, the emperor of the Aztec Triple Alliance, a powerful and revered ruler who was also a deeply pious man, a prisoner of prophecies that spoke of pale-skinned, bearded gods returning from the Eastern Sea. But this is not a simple story of guns, germs, and steel. It is far more complex, more tragic, and more terrible. It is a story of profound cultural misunderstandings, of political genius, of incredible bravery on both sides, and of betrayals that would shape a continent. It is the story of how a small band of invaders was able to exploit the deep cracks of hatred in the foundation of the Aztec Empire, turning a war of conquest into a brutal civil war. And it is the story of a silent, invisible ally, a biological plague that would kill more Aztecs than any Spanish sword. This is the story of a collision, not of two armies, but of two planets that had evolved on opposite sides of the universe, and were now, for the first time, meeting in a cataclysmic, world-shattering impact. This is the story of the death of the fifth sun. This is the story of the fall of the Aztecs. The men who would unmake a world were not the shining paladins of a holy crusade, nor were they the disciplined, state-sponsored soldiers of a great imperial machine like the Roman legions. They were something far more volatile, far more desperate, and ultimately far more dangerous. They were a product of a unique and brutal moment in Spanish history. A generation of men forged in the crucible of the Reconquista, the centuries-long, bloody war to reclaim Spain from its Moorish rulers. This was a conflict that had blurred the lines between a soldier and a fanatic, between a crusader and a bandit. It had created a class of men who knew nothing but war, who were addicted to the intoxicating cocktail of religious fervor and the promise of plunder. They were proud, hard, unspeakably cruel, and possessed of a ferocious sense of individual honor. And when the final Moorish kingdom of Granada fell in 1492, this entire class of professional killers was suddenly, dangerously, unemployed. That same year, a new world had been discovered. And for these restless, ambitious men of the sword, it was a godsend. It was a new frontier, a new crusade, a vast, unknown continent brimming with rumors of unimaginable wealth, of golden cities and pagan souls just waiting to be conquered for God and for gold, though not always in that order. They were the conquistadors, the conquerors. They were not, for the most part, the great nobles of Spain. They were the second sons with no inheritance, the minor gentry from the harsh, impoverished lands of Extremadura, the debtors fleeing their creditors, and the criminals seeking a new start. They were the desperate and the dispossessed, men with everything to gain and absolutely nothing to lose. And they flocked to the newly established Spanish colonies in the Caribbean, to islands like Hispaniola and Cuba, which became the rough, violent staging grounds for their private enterprises of conquest. It was in this chaotic, get-rich-or-die-trying environment of colonial Cuba that our story's protagonist first truly distinguished himself. His name was Hernán Cortés. He was not a muscle-bound warrior or a grim-faced fanatic. He was a man of medium height, slender, but with a powerful chest and a sharp, intelligent face. His greatest weapons were not the sword and musket, but his silver tongue, his boundless charisma, and a mind that was as cunning and as complex as a chess grandmaster's. He was a university-educated man, trained in law, a skill that made him a master of manipulating contracts, loopholes, and people. He had come to the New World seeking his fortune and had found a measure of success as a colonial administrator and landowner in Cuba, a position that had earned him wealth and a degree of comfort. But comfort was a cage for a man like Cortés. He was possessed by a ravenous, all-consuming ambition, a desire not just for wealth, but for glory, for fame, for a legacy that would echo through the ages. And across the water to the west lay a land that whispered of such a legacy. For years, rumors had been trickling back to Cuba from failed expeditions, tales of a mysterious, powerful, and fabulously wealthy empire on the mainland. A land ruled by a great king, a city made of gold, a civilization that dwarfed anything the Spanish had yet encountered in the New World. This was the prize that Cortés craved, and he began to use every ounce of his charm, his political skill, and his personal fortune to win the commission for a new expedition to this land. His patron and his primary obstacle was the governor of Cuba, a cautious and deeply jealous man named Diego Velázquez. Velázquez saw the ambition burning in Cortés's eyes and rightly did not trust him. He feared, correctly, that Cortés was not the kind of man who would be content to be a mere subordinate. But Cortés was a master of persuasion. He flattered Velázquez. He made promises. He invested his own considerable fortune, and he worked tirelessly to assemble a fleet, to recruit men, and to provision an expedition. He moved with such speed and efficiency that Velázquez grew even more alarmed. At the last possible second, his jealousy and suspicion overriding his judgment, Velázquez revoked the commission. He sent messengers to the port of Santiago with orders to remove Cortés from command. It was too late. Cortés had been warned. In a final, brazen act of open defiance, a move that legally transformed him from a commander into a mutineer and a traitor. Cortés and his fleet of 11 small ships set sail in the middle of the night, just hours before the governor's orders could be enforced. He had burned his bridges. He was now a man without a country, a rogue agent, his life and the lives of his 500 men forfeit, unless he could return not just with plunder, but with a prize so vast, so spectacular, that it would force the King of Spain himself to overlook his treason and grant him a royal pardon. He was not just exploring, he was gambling for his own neck. In the spring of 1519, this small band of outlaws and adventurers landed on the coast of what is now Mexico. The world they had stepped into was utterly alien, a vibrant, complex tapestry of cultures, languages, and political rivalries. But it was dominated by one overarching power, the Aztec Triple Alliance, or what we know as the Aztec Empire. Almost immediately, emissaries from the great emperor Moctezuma II arrived at the Spanish camp. They came bearing gifts of astonishing richness and artistry, intricate featherwork, fine cotton robes, and most fatefully, massive wheel-sized discs of solid gold and silver, one carved to represent the sun, the other the moon. These gifts were intended to be a display of overwhelming power, a message from a god-king to these strange newcomers, a message that said, "This is who we are, be impressed, and then leave." But to the gold-starved conquistadors, the message received was the exact opposite. Their eyes, wide with a feverish, almost religious lust for gold, saw not a warning, but a confirmation. The rumors were true. This land was not just rich, it was unimaginably, mythically wealthy. There was no turning back now. But the sight of this great wealth also had a demoralizing effect on some of Cortés's men. They were a small band, 500 strong, in the heart of a massive, powerful, and clearly hostile empire. The odds were insane. A faction of men loyal to Governor Velázquez began to plot, planning to seize a ship and sail back to Cuba to report Cortés's treason. Cortés, his expedition on the verge of collapse before it had even begun, discovered the plot. His response was swift and merciless. He had the ringleaders arrested and promptly hanged. The other conspirators were brutally flogged. And then, he made the move that would forever cement his legend, the single greatest gamble in a life filled with them. He gathered his men on the beach. He gave them a speech, a masterpiece of rhetoric, appealing to their faith, their greed, and their sense of honor. He painted a picture of the glorious riches and the eternal fame that awaited them, a prize that would make them legends. And then, as his men listened, enraptured, he gave a secret order. His most loyal shipmasters went to the 11 ships anchored in the bay, and, one by one, they scuttled them. They bored holes in their hulls, ran them aground, and stripped them of their sails and rigging. His men watched in stunned silence as their only link to the outside world, their only means of escape, was systematically destroyed. The ships were gone. They were now stranded, 500 men on the shores of a hostile continent, with a vast and powerful empire in front of them and a treason charge awaiting them behind. There was no retreat. There was no escape. The only way home was forward, forward through the heart of the Aztec Empire, forward to the golden city of Tenochtitlan, forward to victory or to a bloody death on a sacrificial altar. Cortés had not just burned his bridges, he had sunk them. He had transformed his expedition from a choice into a certainty. He had turned his army into a cornered beast, and as any hunter knows, a cornered beast is the most dangerous of all. The world that Hernán Cortés and his 500 men were about to invade was not the primitive, sparsely populated wilderness they might have imagined. It was a civilization, a complex, sophisticated, and deeply ancient tapestry of peoples that had evolved in complete isolation from the rest of humanity for over 10,000 years. And at its heart, the undisputed masters of this world were the people known as the Mexica, the architects of the mighty Aztec Empire. To understand the sheer, breathtaking audacity of the Spanish conquest, one must first understand the scale, the power, and the profoundly alien nature of the empire they sought to conquer. The Aztec Empire was a relatively new creation, the product of a century of brutal warfare and shrewd political maneuvering. The Mexica themselves were originally a nomadic outcast tribe who, according to their own legends, had been guided by their ferocious son and war god, Huitzilopochtli, to a prophesied destination. The sign they were looking for was an eagle, perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. In the year 1325, they found this sign on a small swampy island in the middle of the vast Lake Texcoco, in the high central valley of Mexico. And there, in this improbable, waterlogged location, they began to build their capital, their home, their center of the universe, the city of Tenochtitlan. What they built was an engineering marvel, a city that would have stunned even the most jaded Roman or Venetian architect. It was a floating metropolis, a vast intricate network of artificial islands, or chinampas, connected by a web of canals and raised stone causeways that led back to the mainland. It was a city of water, where goods and people moved not on wheels, which the Aztecs did not use for transport, but in thousands of dugout canoes that plied the canals. At its center stood the ceremonial heart of the empire, the Great Temple, or Templo Mayor, a colossal twin-stepped pyramid that soared nearly 200 feet into the sky. One shrine at its peak was dedicated to the rain god Tlaloc, its steps painted a brilliant blue. The other, dedicated to the war god Huitzilopochtli, was stained a dark, terrifying permanent red with the blood of countless human sacrifices. Surrounding this sacred precinct were the sprawling, magnificent palaces of the emperor and the nobility, vast, multi-roomed structures with their own botanical gardens, aviaries, and private zoos. The city was a place of stunning contrasts. Its markets, like the Great Market at Tlatelolco, were the largest in the world. Vast, orderly squares where tens of thousands of people gathered daily to trade everything from gold, silver, and precious jade to fine textiles, exotic foods, and, most chillingly, a thriving market for human slaves. The city was meticulously clean, with teams of workers sweeping the streets daily. It had public latrines and a system of aqueducts that brought fresh water into the city from the mainland. To the Spanish conquistadors who first laid eyes on it, it was a dream. The soldier Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who was with Cortés, wrote in his memoir that they were so astounded by the sight of the gleaming white city on the lake that they thought they were seeing something from a storybook. Some of our soldiers even asked whether the things that we saw were not a dream, he wrote. It was a city of more than 200,000 people, larger than any city in Spain at the time, and perhaps the most populous city in the world outside of China. It was the glittering golden head of a vast and terrible body. The Aztec Empire was not a unified, centralized state like the Roman Empire. It was a hegemonic or tributary empire, an alliance of three great city-states, with Tenochtitlan as the undisputed senior partner. They did not rule by direct occupation. Instead, they ruled by fear. Their armies, vast and disciplined forces of elite jaguar and eagle warriors, would sweep out from the Central Valley and conquer the surrounding city-states. But they would not leave a garrison. Instead, they would demand tribute. This tribute was the lifeblood of the empire, and it took many forms. Precious goods like gold, jade, and feathers, vast quantities of food and textiles, and most importantly, human lives. The conquered cities were required to periodically send a quota of their own people to Tenochtitlan to be sacrificed to the Aztec gods. This practice of mass human sacrifice was the dark, beating heart of the Aztec worldview. It was not, in their minds, an act of arbitrary cruelty. It was a sacred, cosmic necessity. According to their cosmology, the world had already passed through 4 previous cycles, or suns, each of which had ended in a divine apocalypse. They were living under the 5th sun, a fragile and unstable creation that was in constant danger of being extinguished. Their sun god, Huitzilopochtli, was in a perpetual cosmic war against the forces of darkness. To fuel his fight, to keep the sun rising every morning, he required the most precious nourishment imaginable, chalchihuatl, or precious water, human blood. The scale of the ritual killing was almost impossible for the European mind to comprehend. While the exact numbers are debated, it is clear that thousands of victims were sacrificed each year. At the dedication of the Great Temple in 1487, it is said that as many as 20,000 captives were sacrificed over a period of 4 days, a line of victims stretching for miles. The method was swift, brutal, and highly ritualized. The victim was led to the top of the Great Pyramid, held down over a sacrificial stone by 4 priests, while a 5th priest would use an obsidian knife, a blade of razor-sharp volcanic glass, to slice open their chest. He would then reach into the cavity, rip out the still-beating heart, and hold it up to the sun as an offering. The lifeless body was then kicked down the steep steps of the pyramid, where it was collected at the bottom to be dismembered, the limbs often cooked and eaten in a ritual cannibalistic feast. This constant, insatiable demand for sacrificial victims was the primary driver of Aztec warfare. Their wars were often not wars of annihilation, but flower wars, ritualized campaigns whose main purpose was to capture enemy warriors alive for the sacrificial stone. This unique military doctrine, so alien to the European concept of total war, would prove to be a fatal weakness when they faced the Spanish, who fought not to capture, but to kill. This system of rule, of terror, tribute, and sacrifice had made the Aztecs immensely powerful and unimaginably wealthy, but it had also made them universally hated. The empire was not a stable, unified entity. It was a fragile pyramid built on a foundation of simmering, resentful subject peoples. The cities they had conquered did not see themselves as part of a glorious Aztec empire. They saw themselves as oppressed vassals, their wealth drained, their sons and daughters stolen to feed the hungry gods of their masters. They paid their tribute, but they did so with clenched teeth, their hearts filled with a deep and bitter hatred, waiting, praying for a day of reckoning. It was this fundamental internal weakness, this network of deep political fractures, that Cortés, with his brilliant and predatory political instincts, would discover and exploit. He was not, he would soon realize, invading a unified empire. He was stepping into a continental-scale powder keg, a world filled with oppressed peoples who were just waiting for a spark, for an outside force that could give them the hope and the means to rise up against their hated masters. The men from nowhere had arrived at the gates of a world of gold and blood, and they had, without knowing it, brought the very match that would set it all on fire. While Hernán Cortés and his small band of adventurers were driven by a simple and brutal calculus of greed and survival, the man they were marching to confront was a prisoner of a far more complex and terrifying universe. Moctezuma II, the Tlatoani, or Great Speaker of the Aztec Triple Alliance, was not a weak or indecisive ruler. By the time the Spanish arrived, he had been on the throne for nearly 2 decades, a period marked by the relentless and successful expansion of his empire. He was a proven military leader, a shrewd politician, and a deeply, almost fanatically, devout high priest of his people's intricate and blood-soaked religion. He was the absolute ruler of the most powerful empire the Mesoamerican world had ever known, a man whose every word was law, whose every whim was a command. He was not just a king, he was a semi-divine being, the living embodiment of the will of the gods on earth. And it was this very piety, this profound and unshakable belief in the cosmic order he presided over, that would become his undoing. His greatest strength would become his most fatal weakness. The Aztec worldview was not one of easy confidence. It was a worldview steeped in a deep, cyclical fatalism. They were a people acutely aware of their own fragility, living in a universe that was fundamentally unstable, a universe that had already been destroyed 4 times and was destined for a 5th final apocalypse. Their entire religious and state apparatus was a massive, complex, and bloody effort to forestall this inevitable doom, to keep the cosmic clock ticking through constant ritual and sacrifice. They were a people who looked for signs, for omens, for portents in the natural world, a people who believed that the gods spoke not in clear commands, but in a language of symbols and prophecies. And in the years leading up to 1519, the gods, it seemed, were screaming. A series of terrifying and inexplicable omens had descended upon the Valley of Mexico, each one more unsettling than the last. A brilliant tongue-shaped flame had appeared in the eastern sky, burning for an entire year, a comet of ill omen. The temple of Huitzilopochtli itself, the sacred heart of the empire, had spontaneously burst into flames, the fire so fierce that it could not be extinguished by water. A second temple was struck by a bolt of lightning on a windless, rainless day. The waters of Lake Texcoco had, for no reason, boiled and surged, flooding a portion of the city. Fishermen had caught a strange, ash-colored bird with a mirror set into its head, in which Moctezuma reportedly saw a vision of a great host of strange 4-legged creatures carrying men on their backs, men with pale skin and beards, coming to make war. And most terrifyingly of all, a wailing spectral woman was heard crying in the streets of the city at night, a mournful voice lamenting the fate of her children, the spirit of La Llorona, the weeping woman, a portent of national doom. For Moctezuma, a man whose life was dedicated to interpreting such signs. These omens were not just curiosities, they were a horrifying confirmation of a deep-seated fear. They were the harbingers of a great and terrible change, the prophesied end of the fifth sun. And they all seemed to point to the fulfillment of the single most potent and dangerous legend in the Aztec canon, the return of the god Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, was one of the most ancient and revered deities in the Mesoamerican pantheon. He was a god of creation, of wisdom, of the wind, and of the morning star. Unlike the bloody Huitzilopochtli, he was a god who was said to abhor human sacrifice, preferring offerings of flowers, jade, and butterflies. The legend told that Quetzalcoatl, who was often depicted as a pale-skinned, bearded man, had once ruled over a golden age of peace and prosperity, but he had been tricked and shamed by a rival deity and had been forced to flee his kingdom, sailing away to the east, across the Great Sea. But before he left, he had made a solemn promise that he would one day return from the east to reclaim his rightful throne. And the year of his prophesied return, according to the complex and intricate Aztec calendar, was the year one reed. By a staggering, world-shattering coincidence, the year 1519, the year Hernán Cortés landed on the coast, was the year one reed. When the first reports reached Moctezuma of the strange, floating mountains that had appeared on the eastern sea, carrying men with skin as white as chalk, with hair on their faces, who wielded weapons that created thunder and lightning, and who rode upon massive deer-like beasts that snorted and stamped, his reaction was not one of military aggression. It was one of profound religious terror. The description of these newcomers, these men from nowhere, perfectly matched the ancient descriptions of Quetzalcoatl and his divine retinue. The prophecies were being fulfilled. The omens were true. A god had returned to reclaim his kingdom. This belief paralyzed Moctezuma. He was trapped in a cognitive prison, a cage built from his own piety. How does a mortal king make war upon a god? If he attacked these beings, and they were truly divine, his impiety would bring about the instant destruction of his entire world. If he welcomed them, he would be willingly surrendering his own throne and the entire empire built by his ancestors. He was caught in a state of agonizing indecision, a paralysis that would characterize his entire disastrous interaction with the Spanish. His response was therefore not to send an army to annihilate the newcomers, which he could have easily done. Instead, he chose a path of appeasement, of reverence, and of testing. The magnificent gifts of gold and silver he sent to Cortés were not just a display of wealth. They were a divine offering, a tribute from a mortal king to a returning god. But they were also a test. The Aztecs believed that the true gods were not interested in the gross materiality of gold. They were interested in the spiritual nourishment of blood and sacrifice. So, along with the golden sun disk, Moctezuma's emissaries brought another, more sacred offering, food sprinkled with the fresh blood of a human sacrifice. They offered it to Cortés. The Spanish, Christians who saw the devil in this pagan rite, reacted with horror and disgust, turning away from the blood-soaked food. To Moctezuma, this was a confusing, ambiguous result, and so he continued this policy of vacillation. One moment, he would send emissaries forbidding the Spanish from approaching his capital. The next, he would send them more lavish gifts, as if trying to placate an angry deity. He was a man trying to negotiate with an earthquake, attempting to use the subtle, courtly language of Mesoamerican diplomacy on men who understood only the brutal direct language of conquest. He could have summoned his vast armies and wiped the 500 Spaniards from the face of the earth with a single command. But he hesitated. He waited for a clear sign, a definitive proof of the newcomer's divinity. He was a high priest, trying to read the entrails of a situation that required the swift, brutal decisiveness of a king. This paralysis, this fatal inability to identify his enemy for what they were, not gods, but mortal men, driven by a lust for gold and glory, was Moctezuma's greatest and most tragic failure. He was a brilliant and powerful ruler of his own world, but he was utterly unprepared for the arrival of a new one. He was a man playing a complex game of religious chess, while his opponent, Hernán Cortés, was playing a simple, brutal game of winner-take-all. The prophecies that had been the foundation of his power had now become the bars of his cage, a cage in which he would sit, paralyzed, while the strange, pale-skinned men from the sea marched ever closer to the gates of his sacred, floating city. He was not just facing an invasion, he was facing what he believed was the end of his entire cosmos. While Moctezuma sat paralyzed in his golden capital, a prisoner of prophecy and dread, Hernán Cortés was a man in constant predatory motion. His goal was the great city of Tenochtitlan, but he was not a fool. He knew that a direct, headlong march with his tiny army of 500 men would be an act of suicidal madness. The gifts from Moctezuma had revealed the empire's wealth, but they had also revealed its immense power. To conquer this new world, Cortés knew he needed more than just steel and gunpowder. He needed knowledge, he needed allies, and he needed to transform his small band of foreign invaders into the catalyst for a continental-scale civil war. He would not conquer the Aztec Empire. He would give it the means to conquer itself. His first great stroke of luck, a gift from the gods of conquest, had come shortly after he landed. In a skirmish with a local Mayan tribe, he had been given, as part of the peace offering, a group of 20 female slaves, and among them was a young woman of extraordinary intelligence and linguistic genius. Her name was Malintzin, known to the Spanish as Doña Marina, and to history as the controversial and indispensable La Malinche. She was not Mayan. She was a Nahua noblewoman, the daughter of a chieftain who had been sold into slavery as a child. She spoke Mayan, but more importantly, she spoke Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs. She became more than just an interpreter. She became Cortés's co-strategist, his cultural advisor, his mistress, and the indispensable key that would unlock the complex political landscape of the empire. Through her ears, Cortés began to truly hear the whispers of this new world. And what he heard was a symphony of hatred, a chorus of resentment from 100 different subject peoples, all groaning under the brutal, blood-soaked yoke of Aztec domination. Guided by this new understanding, Cortés made his first great strategic move. He would not march directly to Tenochtitlan. He would march towards a place he had heard spoken of with a mixture of fear and respect, the independent kingdom of Tlaxcala. Tlaxcala was a paradox, an anomaly in the Aztec-dominated world. It was a small, fiercely independent highland republic, completely surrounded by the lands of the Aztec Triple Alliance. For decades, they had been a thorn in the side of the empire, an unconquered island of defiance in the middle of an Aztec sea. They were in a perpetual state of low-grade, ritualized warfare with the Aztecs, the Flower Wars, whose primary purpose was to provide a steady stream of captives for the sacrificial altars of both sides. They were, in short, the Aztec Empire's oldest, most bitter, and most implacable enemies. Their hatred for the Mexica was a defining feature of their national identity, a hatred that burned with the cold, hard fire of generations. This was the ally Cortés needed. If he could convince the Tlaxcalans to join him, he would not just gain soldiers, he would gain the legitimacy of a native partner in his war against Tenochtitlan. But the Tlaxcalans were not waiting with open arms. They were a proud and deeply suspicious people, and when these strange, pale-skinned men, with their monstrous deer and their thundersticks began to march towards their territory, their first reaction was not one of alliance, but of ferocious, violent resistance. They saw the Spanish not as potential liberators, but simply as a new and bizarrely shaped threat. What followed was not a single battle, but a brutal, 3-week-long campaign that nearly ended Cortés's entire expedition. The Tlaxcalans were magnificent warriors. They threw themselves at the small Spanish force with a suicidal bravery that stunned the conquistadors. Their armies, tens of thousands strong, surged across the plains in great, screaming waves. The Spanish, for the first time, faced a truly organized, disciplined, and utterly determined native army. The small band of 500 Spaniards was pushed to the absolute brink of annihilation. They survived through a combination of superior weaponry, disciplined tactics, and sheer, desperate grit. The Spanish steel sword, the espada, was a weapon of almost magical lethality against the obsidian-bladed clubs, the macuahuitl of the Aztecs. A macuahuitl could inflict horrific, jagged wounds, but it could not pierce Spanish steel armor. The Spanish sword, on the other hand, could kill with a single, clean thrust. The crossbows and arquebuses, though slow to reload, had a terrifying psychological effect, creating thunder and smoke and killing men from a distance. And then there was the cavalry. The horse was Cortés's greatest weapon. To the natives of Mesoamerica, who had never seen such an animal, the sight of a man on horseback was a terrifying and supernatural apparition. They did not see a man and an animal. They saw a single, monstrous, two-headed, six-legged beast, a centaur-like god of war, that moved with terrifying speed and could trample a man to death under its iron-shod hooves. The 16 horsemen that Cortés possessed were not just a cavalry wing. They were a force of psychological shock and awe. For weeks, the battle raged. The Spanish would form a tight defensive square, a hedgehog of pikes and swords, and endure the human tidal waves of the Tlaxcalan charges. Every day was a desperate struggle for survival. The soldiers were exhausted, their armor dented, their supplies dwindling. Bernal Diaz wrote that they were so terrified, they confessed to our priest and commended ourselves to God and prepared for battle. They were on the verge of being overwhelmed, but even as they fought, Cortés, the eternal politician, was working. He would capture Tlaxcalan warriors, treat them with a surprising courtesy, and then send them back to their leaders with a message. The message was always the same. We do not come as your enemies. We come as the enemies of your great enemy, the Mexica. Join us, and together we will see them fall. Inside the Tlaxcalan War Council, a furious debate was raging. The leader of their armies, a fierce young chieftain named Xicotencatl, the Younger, argued for total war. He saw the Spanish for what they were, dangerous, rapacious invaders. He believed they could be beaten, and he came close to proving it. But the older faction in the council, led by his own father, Xicotencatl the Elder, began to see a different possibility. They had been fighting the Aztecs for 100 years, and they were slowly losing. Their young men were being bled away in the flower wars, their trade routes were blockaded, their nation was being slowly strangled. And now, these strange, seemingly invincible men from the sea had arrived, men who hated the Mexica as much as they did. Perhaps, the old chieftains argued, these newcomers were not a threat, but an opportunity. A terrible, dangerous, but perhaps God-sent opportunity to finally break the Aztec yoke. After one last, brutal, and ultimately failed Tlaxcalan assault, the peace party finally won the argument. An embassy was sent to Cortés's blood-soaked and exhausted camp. The war was over. The Tlaxcalans were ready to talk. The alliance that was forged in the aftermath was the single most important turning point of the entire conquest. It was a pact sealed not by friendship, but by a shared, all-consuming hatred. The Tlaxcalans agreed to become vassals of the Spanish king, and in return, the Spanish would be their partners in the final war against the Aztec Empire. Cortés and his weary men marched into the city of Tlaxcala, not as conquerors, but as honored, terrifying guests. The same warriors who'd been trying to kill them just days before now welcomed them with feasts and celebration. And as they entered the city, the Spanish saw for the first time the true, visceral depth of the hatred for Moctezuma. They saw public murals depicting Tlaxcalan warriors cutting the hearts out of Mexica captives. They heard the stories of generations of brutal warfare. They saw the cages where Aztec captives were being fattened for sacrifice. Cortés now had his army. He had his base of operations deep within the enemy's homeland, and he had thousands of the fiercest warriors in Mexico at his side. The Spanish invasion was no longer a foreign affair. It had now become a native revolution, a great continental-scale civil war, with a handful of Spanish conquistadors holding the lit match. The stage was set for the march on Tenochtitlan, but now Cortés would not be marching as an invader. He would be marching as a liberator, at the head of a vast, vengeful native army. The serpent was about to eat itself, and Cortés would be the one to guide its fangs. The road to Tenochtitlan was a path paved with blood and psychological terror. Having forged his alliance of hate with the Tlaxcalans, Hernán Cortés was no longer merely a foreign interloper. He was the head of a massive, vengeful native host. But before he could reach the gates of the capital, he had to pass through the sacred city of Cholula, the second largest city in Mexico and the spiritual heart of the cult of Quetzalcoatl. What happened there would serve as a grim warning to Moctezuma. These men from the sea were not just gods, they were butchers. The massacre at Cholula remains one of the most controversial and bloody episodes of the Conquest. Cortés claimed his interpreter Malintzin had discovered a secret Aztec plot to ambush the Spanish within the city walls. Whether the plot was real or a convenient fabrication, Cortés's response was an act of preemptive, industrial-scale slaughter. He lured the city's nobility and thousands of unarmed warriors into a closed courtyard and, at a prearranged signal, unleashed his cannons and muskets. In the space of a few hours, between 3,000 and 6,000 Cholulans were slaughtered. The city was plundered and burned. The message was sent: walls could not protect you, and the gods would not save you. The men from nowhere had proven they possessed a lethality that was absolute. On November 8th, 1519, the Spanish Tlaxcalan army finally crested the mountain passes and looked down into the Valley of Mexico. The sight that greeted them was so magnificent, it felt like a hallucination. There, in the center of a vast, shimmering blue lake, lay Tenochtitlan, the Venice of the New World. Its white pyramids and towers gleamed in the sun like salt, connected to the mainland by stone causeways so straight and wide that 8 horsemen could ride abreast. Bernal Diaz del Castillo wrote that they were struck with a sense of enchantment, wondering if they were in a dream. But as they descended the slopes and began their march along the southern causeway, the awe was tempered by a cold, creeping dread. They were 500 men marching into a city of 200,000 warriors. They were walking directly into the mouth of the serpent. The meeting between Cortés and Moctezuma on the Great Causeway was a collision of 2 universes. Moctezuma arrived in a litter draped in fine cotton and shaded by a canopy of brilliant green feathers, carried by the highest nobles of his empire. He was a figure of such immense sanctity that no one was permitted to look him in the eye, and the ground before him was swept clean as he walked. He stepped from his litter, wearing golden sandals, and for the first time looked upon the face of the man who had haunted his prophecies. Cortés, ever the politician, dismounted his horse and attempted to embrace the emperor, a gesture of European greeting that was, to the Aztecs, a shocking and sacrilegious violation of a god-king's person. He was stopped by the emperor's attendants. Through Malintzin, the 2 leaders exchanged words of calculated courtesy. Moctezuma welcomed Cortés, referring to him as a returning lord. "You have come back to your city, to your throne. Rest now from the labors of your journey." To Moctezuma, this was a desperate attempt to frame the invasion as a peaceful restoration, a way to maintain his dignity while submitting to what he believed was divine fate. To Cortés, it was a confirmation that his enemy's mind was already defeated. The Spanish were led into the heart of the city and housed in the vast, labyrinthine palace of Axayacatl, the home of Moctezuma's father. For a week, they lived in a state of surreal tension. They were guests of the highest honor, showered with gold, fine food, and exotic luxuries. But they were also prisoners. They were surrounded by water, Their only escape routes the narrow causeways that could be cut at any moment. They were a tiny island of steel in a vast ocean of hostile humanity. The tension within the Spanish camp reached a breaking point when, while exploring their quarters, they discovered a recently plastered-over doorway. Breaking it open, they found the legendary Treasure of Tlaxcalans, a chamber filled from floor to ceiling with gold, silver, precious jade, and intricate jewelry. The sight of such concentrated wealth nearly drove the conquistadors mad with greed, but it also crystallized their fear. They realized they were sitting on a fortune they could never hope to carry away as long as the Aztecs remained free. Cortés realized that the status quo was unsustainable. He was a gambler who knew that if you sit at a table for too long, the house eventually wins. He needed a masterstroke, a move so audacious it would paralyze the entire empire and give him total control of the board. He decided to do the unthinkable. He would kidnap the God King in his own palace. Using the excuse of a minor skirmish on the coast where a few Spaniards had been killed, Cortés, accompanied by 30 of his most heavily armed veterans, requested an audience with Moctezuma. In the middle of the throne room, surrounded by Aztec nobility, Cortés dropped the mask of friendship. He accused Moctezuma of treachery and delivered a brutal ultimatum. The emperor must leave his palace and move into the Spanish quarters as their guest. If he refused, or if any alarm was raised, he would be killed on the spot. It was a moment of agonizing, world-altering silence. Moctezuma, the absolute ruler of millions, was stunned. He argued, he pleaded, he offered his children as hostages in his place. But the conquistadors were unyielding. One of them, the hot-headed Pedro de Alvarado, drew his sword and shouted, "What is the use of all these words? Let us either take him or kill him." Moctezuma, seeing the cold steel and the even colder eyes of the men before him, finally collapsed. He realized his divinity was a hollow shell against the brutal reality of Spanish steel. He agreed to go. He told his weeping nobles that it was the will of the gods. The kidnapping of Moctezuma remains one of the most incredible feats of audacity in history. In a single hour, without firing a shot, 500 men had effectively decapitated the largest empire in the Americas. Moctezuma remained on his throne, issuing decrees and collecting tribute. But the words were now those of Hernán Cortés. The emperor was a puppet, a golden shield, behind which the Spanish began to systematically dismantle and plunder his world. They melted down the priceless artwork of the treasury into crude gold bars. They desecrated the temples with Christian crosses, and they treated the Aztec lords with increasing contempt. But while Moctezuma remained a prisoner of his own fatalism, his people were not. The shock of the kidnapping was wearing off, replaced by a deep, simmering, and homicidal rage. They saw their king humiliated, their gods insulted, and their wealth stolen by a pack of rapacious strangers. The serpent's jaws were not yet shut, but they were beginning to twitch. The Spanish were in the heart of the city, but they had underestimated the fury of a people who believed their world was ending. The peace of Tenochtitlan was a thin crust over a volcano, and it was about to erupt in the explosion of violence that would make the previous slaughter seem like a skirmish. The peace in Tenochtitlan had always been an illusion, a thin layer of cooling lava over a roaring volcanic heart. By the spring of 1520, that crust was beginning to disintegrate. The kidnapping of Moctezuma had decapitated the empire's leadership, but it had not broken its spirit. If anything, the sight of their semi-divine emperor being held in chains, forced to do the bidding of bearded strangers, had transformed the Aztecs' initial religious awe into a cold, diamond-hard hatred. The city was no longer a host, it was a cage, and the 500 Spaniards and their Tlaxcalan allies were the animals trapped inside. But before the explosion occurred, Hernán Cortés was forced to face a threat from his own world that nearly ended his gamble before the Aztecs could. News reached the city that a massive Spanish fleet, commanded by Pánfilo de Narváez, had landed on the coast. He had not been sent by the king to reinforce Cortés. He had been sent by the vengeful governor Velázquez of Cuba to arrest him for treason. Cortés was now facing a war on two fronts, a massive Aztec uprising in front of him, and a superior Spanish force at his back. With the characteristic audacity that defined his life, Cortés made a split-second decision. He left Tenochtitlan with half of his best men to confront Narvaez, leaving the rest of the garrison under the command of his most loyal but most volatile captain, Pedro de Alvarado. It was a catastrophic choice of personnel. Alvarado, known to the Aztecs as Tonatiuh, or the Sun, because of his blonde hair and fierce temperament, was a man of immense courage but zero political nuance. He lacked Cortés's ability to play the long game. He saw only the immediate threat, and his solution to every problem was the sword. While Cortés was away, the Aztecs requested permission to hold their annual festival of Tlaxcalans, a major religious event honoring the god Huitzilopochtli. Alvarado, already on edge and hearing rumors of an impending attack, granted permission, but grew increasingly paranoid as he watched thousands of high-ranking Aztec nobles and elite warriors gather in the courtyard of the great temple, dancing and chanting in their magnificent feathered regalia. What happened next was an act of preemptive butchery that destroyed any hope of a peaceful Spanish presence in Mexico. Believing, or claiming to believe, that the dancers were preparing for an ambush, Alvarado ordered his men to block the exits of the courtyard. Then, the Spanish poured in with their steel swords and pikes. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter of the unarmed elite. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of the empire's most important leaders and warriors were hacked to pieces in their ceremonial finery. The courtyard became a lake of blood. The reaction of the city was instantaneous and apocalyptic. The people of Tenochtitlan, who had endured months of humiliation for the sake of their captive king, finally snapped. A roar went up from the metropolis that could be heard for miles. The Aztecs did not wait for a council or a command. They rose as one. The Spanish garrison was driven back into the palace of Axayacatl, where they were instantly besieged by tens of thousands of enraged warriors. The food supplies were cut, the aqueducts were smashed, and the serpent's jaws finally slammed shut. Cortés, having miraculously defeated and absorbed Narvaez's forces on the coast, returned to the Valley of Mexico to find a world on fire. He marched back into Tenochtitlan through streets that were eerily, terrifyingly silent. He reached the palace and joined the besieged Alvarado, but he soon realized he had only succeeded in trapping his entire army in a tomb. The Aztecs had removed the bridges from the causeways. The lake was filled with thousands of war canoes. Every rooftop was an enemy fortress. In a final, desperate attempt to regain control, Cortés forced the wounded and humiliated Moctezuma to the rooftop of the palace. He ordered the emperor to address the screaming mob below, to command them to stop the fighting and let the Spanish depart in peace. It was Moctezuma's last act as a king, and it was a tragedy. As he appeared on the ramparts, the crowd fell silent for a moment. But then, a voice rang out from the darkness, calling him a coward, a traitor, and a woman. A hail of stones and arrows erupted from the mob. Moctezuma was struck in the head by a heavy stone. He collapsed, and 3 days later, he was dead. The Spanish claimed he died of his wounds and grief, and the Aztecs claimed the Spanish stabbed him when he was no longer useful. Either way, the shield was gone. The God-King was dead, and the last restraint on the Aztec fury had vanished. The Spanish were now starving, their ammunition was running low, and the stench of death inside the palace was becoming unbearable. Cortés realized that if they stayed another day, they would all end up on the sacrificial stones of the great temple. They had to leave. They had to run. The night of June 30th, 1520, was dark and lashed by a torrential summer rainstorm. The perfect cover for a secret retreat. This was La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. Cortés ordered his men to pack only what was necessary, but the greed of the conquistadors proved to be a weight heavier than iron. Many of them, especially the newcomers from Narvaez's fleet, laden themselves with heavy bars of melted-down Aztec gold, stuffing it into their boots and armor. They built a portable wooden bridge to cross the gaps in the causeway where the Aztecs had removed the permanent structures. They moved out in total silence, a long, shivering column of 500 Spaniards and thousands of Tlaxcalans, creeping along the western causeway towards Tlacopan. They almost made it. They had crossed the first two gaps when a woman fetching water spotted them. Her scream pierced the sound of the rain. "Mexica! Come quickly! They are leaving!" The night erupted. The sound of the great wooden drum of the great temple began to boom, a sound that signaled total war. From the darkness of the lake, thousands of canoes swarmed the causeway. From the rooftops, a rain of stones and arrows descended. The retreat turned into a chaotic, screaming vortex of slaughter. The portable bridge became stuck in the mud, rendered immovable by the weight of the thousands of men trying to cross. The gaps in the causeway became bridges of bodies, as men, horses, and wagons tumbled into the water, and those behind them were forced to walk over the corpses of their comrades to reach the other side. The gold, the very thing they had come for, became a death sentence. Hundreds of Spaniards, weighed down by their stolen treasure, fell into the lake and sank like stones, their final moments spent drowning in the dark water of Lake Texcoco, clutching the metal that had cost them their souls. Pedro de Alvarado, leading the rear guard, only survived by performing a legendary, impossible leap over a wide gap in the causeway, using his spear as a vaulting pole, a feat known to this day as El Salto de Alvarado. When the shattered remnants of the army finally reached the mainland at dawn, the scale of the disaster was staggering. Over half of the Spanish force and more than 4,000 Tlaxcalan allies had been killed or captured to be sacrificed. Almost all the gold was lost. The cannons were at the bottom of the lake. The horses were dead. Cortés, the man who had burned his ships to ensure victory, sat beneath a large cypress tree at Tlacopan and, for the first and only time, wept openly as he counted the survivors. The Aztecs had won. They had driven the invaders from their city and reclaimed their world. To any rational observer, the Spanish conquest was over. Cortés was a defeated fugitive with a broken army and no resources. But the Aztecs had made one final mistake. They had let him live. And as Cortés retreated towards Tlaxcala to lick his wounds, he was carrying with him an invisible passenger, a silent ally that would do more to destroy the Aztec Empire than 1,000 Spanish cannons. The Night of Sorrows was the empire's greatest victory, but it had also unleashed the instrument of its certain agonizing death. Of all the weapons in the arsenal of the Spanish conquistadors, the Toledo steel swords, the thundering arquebuses, the terrifying armored horses, none were as devastating, as efficient, or as apocalyptic as the one they didn't even know they were carrying. As Hernán Cortés and the tattered, blood-soaked remnants of his army staggered away from the carnage of La Noche Triste, they were a broken force. They had lost their gold, their artillery, and over half of their brothers in arms. To any observer, the Spanish were the walking dead, doomed to be hunted down in the mountains of central Mexico. But as they retreated toward the sanctuary of Tlaxcala, an invisible, microscopic ally had already infiltrated the gates of Tenochtitlan. It was a stowaway from the old world, a passenger on the ships of Pánfilo de Narváez, and it was about to commit a genocide that would haunt the continent for centuries. This was the silent ally, the variola virus, smallpox. To the people of Mesoamerica, the world was ending not in fire, but in pustules and putrefaction. For 10,000 years, the inhabitants of the Americas had lived in a biological Eden, isolated from the plethora of crowd diseases that had plagued Europe, Asia, and Africa for millennia. They had no immunity, no genetic memory of the sicknesses that jumped from livestock to humans in the Old World. They were a virgin soil population. When the Spanish arrived, they didn't just bring a new god and a new king. They brought a biological bomb that was perfectly calibrated to detonate upon impact with the New World. The spark for this biological wildfire is often attributed to a single man, Francisco de Eguía, an enslaved African soldier who arrived with Narvaez's fleet. He was sick with the fever when he landed at Zempoala, and as the Spanish marched, the virus leaped from host to host, invisible and unstoppable. While the Aztecs were celebrating their magnificent victory over the invaders, while they were cleaning the blood of the Night of Sorrows from the steps of their temples, the virus was incubating in the lungs and bloodstreams of their warriors. The outbreak hit Tenochtitlan in September 1520, and the indigenous accounts of the plague are some of the most harrowing documents in human history. The Aztecs called it Huey Ahuizotl, the Great Rash. It was unlike anything their healers had ever seen. In Europe, smallpox was a childhood disease that killed many but left survivors with lifelong immunity. In Tenochtitlan, it was an undiscriminating reaper. It didn't just kill children. It struck down the strongest eagle and jaguar warriors, the most experienced generals, and the most vital administrators. The Florentine Codex, a massive encyclopedic work compiled later by the Friar Bernardino de Sahagún from native testimonies, describes the horror in visceral, soul-crushing detail. The sores spread over the people's faces, their breasts, and their bellies. They were covered in agonizing, weeping pustules. The pain was so great that the victims could not move. They could not even turn over in their beds. If they moved, they screamed in agony as their skin, stuck to their mats, tore away in bloody sheets. The sores were so great, the Codex records, that many people died from them, but many just died of hunger, for there was no one to care for them. No one could raise their heads. No one could stir from their beds. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical one. The Aztecs were a deeply religious people who saw the hand of the gods in every event. Their gods, Huitzilopochtli, Tezcatlipoca, Tlaloc, had always demanded blood to keep the sun rising. Now, the people were offering their blood in a way they never imagined. They watched as their families rotted alive, while the Spanish, the very men who had brought the Great Rash, seemed largely unaffected. To the Aztec mind, this was the ultimate proof of divine abandonment. It seemed as if the gods of the strangers were not only more powerful, but were actively cursing the Mexica people. The social fabric of the empire, built on a rigid hierarchy of service and ritual, began to unravel as the healers died alongside their patients. But the most catastrophic blow was political. After the death of Moctezuma, the Aztecs had elected his brother, Cuitlahuac, as the new Huey Tlatoani. Cuitlahuac was a brilliant military leader, the very man who had orchestrated the defeat of the Spanish during the Noche Triste. He was the energetic, uncompromising leader the Aztecs needed to finish the war. He had spent his brief reign reaching out to former enemies, trying to forge a massive pan-indigenous alliance to hunt down and exterminate the Spanish in Tlaxcala. He was the one man who could have united the continent against the invaders. In November 1520, after only 80 days on the throne, Cuitlahuac died of smallpox. The loss was irreplaceable. The Aztecs were forced to elect a new leader, the young and courageous Cuauhtémoc, but the momentum was lost. The chain of command was shattered. The virus had effectively decapitated the Aztec government at the very moment it needed to be at its strongest. While Tenochtitlan became a city of ghosts, a place where the living were too few to bury the dead, and the air was thick with a stench of decaying flesh, Hernán Cortés was in Tlaxcala, performing a miracle of his own. Cortés was a man of iron will and terrifying pragmatism. Most men would have taken the Noche Triste as a sign to return to the coast and sail back to Cuba in disgrace. But Cortés was a traitor to the Spanish crown. He had no home to return to. His only options were a spectacular victory or a gruesome death. While the Aztecs died by the thousands in their floating city, Cortés spent the winter of 1520 to 1521 rebuilding his power. He relied on the unwavering loyalty of the Tlaxcalans, who saw the Spanish defeat not as a reason to abandon them, but as a reason to double down. They knew that if the Aztecs won, Tlaxcala would be wiped from the map. Cortés's recovery was a masterpiece of logistics. He sent for reinforcements from the Caribbean, using the gold he had managed to save, and some he had hidden, to buy more horses, more gunpowder, and more men. But his most ambitious project, one that sounds like pure fiction, was the construction of the brigantines. Cortés realized that Tenochtitlan could only be taken from the water. He needed a navy, but he was in the middle of a highland plateau, miles from the sea. His solution was to order his master shipbuilder, Martin Lopez, to build 13 small, maneuverable warships in the forest of Tlaxcala. These ships were built, assembled, and then, in an unbelievable feat of engineering, taken apart. Thousands of Tlaxcalan porters then carried the planks, the masts, the anchors, and the ironwork over the rugged mountain passes, 60 miles to the shores of Lake Texcoco. They carried an entire navy on their backs. While the silent ally was busy hollowing out the Aztec Empire from the inside, Cortés was creating the external force that would crush it. The smallpox epidemic had achieved what the Spanish swords could not. It had leveled the playing field. It had reduced the Aztec population by perhaps 40% in a single year. It had killed their best leaders, demoralized their warriors, and broken their ability to provide food for their capital. By the spring of 1521, Cortés was ready. He looked out over the Valley of Mexico at the head of a massive army. He had nearly 1,000 Spaniards now, but more importantly, he had over 100,000 native allies, Tlaxcalans, Texcocans, and others who had seen the weakness of the Aztecs and decided to join the side they believed was favored by the gods of plague. Tenochtitlan was still magnificent, still beautiful, but it was now a city of the sick and the starving. The serpent's jaws were rotting. The Great Rash had paved the way, turning a war of conquest into a cleanup operation. Cortés was about to begin the final siege, but the victory had already been won in the bloodstreams of the Mexica. The fifth sun was not setting behind the mountains. It was being extinguished by an invisible enemy that no Aztec priest could appease and no Aztec warrior could kill. The stage was set for the final, bloody act of the conquest, a siege that would turn the Venice of the New World into the greatest graveyard in history. By the spring of 1521, the air in the Valley of Mexico had changed. The sweet scent of blooming chinampas and the lake's fresh mist had been replaced by the heavy, cloying stench of decay and the acrid smoke of 1,000 cooking fires. The stage was set for the final apocalyptic act in the drama of two worlds. Tenochtitlan, the gleaming jewel of the fifth sun, was no longer the confident predator of the highlands. It was a wounded titan, its lungs raspy with the lingering cough of smallpox, its leadership fractured, and its belly beginning to ache with the first gnawing pangs of hunger. But if Hernán Cortés thought the city would fold like a house of cards, he was fatally mistaken. The Aztecs, led by the young and uncompromising Emperor Cuauhtémoc, had decided that if their world was to end, it would end in a conflagration that would haunt the memory of the sun itself. Cortés was no longer the desperate fugitive who had wept under the cypress tree at Tlacopan. He had spent the months since the Night of Sorrows performing a feat of political and logistical alchemy. In Tlaxcala, he had turned his defeat into a recruiting tool. He had convinced tens of thousands of indigenous warriors, Tlaxcalans, Texcocans, Chalcas, and Xochimilcas, that the gods of the strangers were the new masters of fate. He had reinforced his Spanish corps with adventurers from the Caribbean, men who arrived seeking gold, but found themselves thrust into a war of extermination. By May 1521, Cortés commanded an army the likes of which Mexico had never seen. Nearly 1,000 Spaniards, dozens of horses, a powerful train of heavy artillery, and a staggering native host of over 150,000 men. It was a crusade of the oppressed, led by a man with everything to lose. But the masterstroke of the campaign was not the size of the army, but the nature of the navy. Cortés realized that as long as the Aztecs controlled the water of Lake Texcoco, they were invincible. Their canoes were the lifeblood of the city, bringing in food and reinforcements from the mainland. To break Tenochtitlan, he had to break the lake. And so, in an act of engineering that bordered on the miraculous, the 13 brigantines, the warships built in the forests of Tlaxcala and carried in pieces across the mountains, were reassembled on the shores of Texcoco. These were not mere boats. They were floating fortresses, equipped with sails for speed, oars for maneuverability, and heavy cannons that could blast a hole through 100 canoes at once. The siege began with a calculated act of cruelty. On May 22nd, 1521, Cortés gave the order to destroy the great aqueduct of Chapultepec. This was the city's primary source of fresh water. As the Roman-style arches were smashed and the life-giving flow was cut off, the clock began to tick for the 200,000 souls trapped inside the city. The Aztecs were now forced to drink the brackish, salty water of the lake, which induced sickness and sapped the strength of their warriors. The serpent's jaws were being parched by design. Cortés divided his land forces into 3 massive columns, each commanded by one of his most trusted and most brutal captains. Pedro de Alvarado, the sun god of the massacre, was sent to the western causeway at Tlacopan. Gonzalo de Sandoval, the reliable young officer, took the northern causeway at Tepeyac. Cristobal de Olid was stationed at the southern causeway at Iztapalapa. Cortés himself took command of the brigantines, the iron fist that would coordinate the entire assault from the water. The initial days of the siege were a chaotic and bloody stalemate. The Aztecs were masters of their own terrain. They had removed the bridges from the causeways, creating gaps that the Spanish had to fill with rubble, while under a constant, lethal rain of stones, arrows, and javelins from the rooftops and from the thousands of war canoes swarming the lake. Every foot of ground was paid for in blood. By day, the Spanish and their allies would fight their way forward, filling in a gap and pushing closer to the city center. By night, under the cover of darkness, the Aztecs would paddle out and remove the rubble, undoing the work of 1,000 men in a few hours. It was a Sisyphean struggle of Iron Age engineering against Stone Age tenacity. But on the water, the brigantines were proving decisive. When the Aztec navy, a swarm of nearly 5,000 canoes, attempted a massed attack on the Spanish fleet, Cortés allowed the wind to fill his sails and simply ran them down. The heavy wooden hulls smashed the fragile dugout canoes like eggshells. The cannons barked, sending grapeshot through the crowded ranks of warriors. The water of the lake turned black with blood and wreckage. For the first time in their history, the Mexica lost control of the water. The city was now truly isolated. As the weeks turned into months, the character of the war shifted from a battle of maneuver to a systematic, house-to-house extermination. Cortés realized that he could not win in the narrow, labyrinthine streets of the city. The rooftops were enemy forts, the canals were traps. So, he made a decision of cold, industrial brutality. He decided to erase the city to conquer it. He ordered his native allies, thousands of Tlaxcalans who relished the destruction of their master's pride, to level every building they captured. As the Spanish advanced, they did not just occupy, they demolished. Houses, palaces, and temples were pulled down, and the debris was used to fill the canals, creating a flat, open plain of ruins upon which the Spanish cavalry could operate. Tenochtitlan, the most beautiful city in the world, was being systematically ground into the mud of the lake. Inside the city, the suffering reached a level of horror that defied description. As the food supplies vanished, the people turned to eating anything that could be chewed. They ate the bark of trees, the roots of swamp grass, and the leather of their own shields. They hunted for mice and lizards in the rubble. Thirst was a constant, agonizing companion. The smallpox, though the main wave had passed, continued to claim the weak. The air was a thick, sickly soup of the smell of unburied bodies and the smoke of fires. Cuauhtémoc, the young emperor, remained a figure of unyielding defiance. He was a king of ruins, but he was still a king. He moved through the shrinking territory of his people, encouraging his warriors, reminding them of the fates that awaited them on the Spanish gallows or in the Tlaxcalan slave markets. He used psychological warfare of his own. In one of the most harrowing moments of the siege, the Aztecs managed to capture 62 Spanish soldiers during a failed assault on a causeway. As the rest of the Spanish army watched from a distance, paralyzed with horror, they heard the booming of the great snakeskin drum from the top of the Templo Mayor. They watched as their brothers were led up the steps, their hearts ripped out, and their heads thrown back towards the Spanish lines. The sight broke the spirit of many conquistadors, but for Cortés, it was merely another reason to finish the work. He tightened the noose. By July, the Aztecs were compressed into the northern district of Tlatelolco, the site of their great market. The area became an open-air charnel house. The living were living among the dead, so many that they could not be moved. The Spanish were now entering a city that was effectively a massive rotting grave. The final assault began in August. The brigantines moved in for the kill, their cannons raking the crowded shores of Tlatelolco. The land columns merged into a single, overwhelming tidal wave of steel and native fury. The Tlaxcalans, their ancestral hatred now fully unleashed, showed no mercy. They slaughtered men, women, and children with a ferocity that shocked even the hardened Spaniards. Cortés himself noted that the screams of the dying were so loud that they covered the sound of the drums. On August 13th, 1521, the end finally came. A Spanish brigantine, commanded by Garcia Holguin, spotted a small fleet of noble canoes attempting to escape across the lake. He chased them down and prepared to fire his cannons. A young man stood up in the lead canoe, unarmored and dignified. It was Cuauhtémoc. He surrendered, asking only that his people be spared and that he be taken to Cortés. When the emperor was brought before Cortés on a rooftop overlooking the smoking, leveled ruins of his capital, he did not beg for his life. He looked at the man who had unmade his world and said, "Lord, I have done what I was bound to do in the defense of my city and my people. I can do no more. Since I am your prisoner, take that dagger from your belt and kill me now." Cortés, the gambler who had won the final pot, did not kill him. Not yet. He treated him with a hollow, calculated respect, but the war was over. As the sun set over the Valley of Mexico, a terrifying silence fell over the ruins of Tenochtitlan. The sound of the drums had stopped. The screams had faded into a low, collective moan of a broken nation. For the first time in 2 centuries, the lake was still. The 5th sun had set, and it would never rise again. Tenochtitlan was dead, and from its ashes, a new, stranger world, New Spain, was about to be born, built on the bones and blood of an empire that had been crushed by 500 men, 1 million allies, and a silent god of plague. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not just the end of a siege, it was a civilizational collapse of such magnitude that it remains a singular, scarring event in the history of the human race. In the space of 2 years, the Aztec Empire, a sophisticated, powerful, and vibrant world of millions, had been violently and irrevocably dismantled. The city that the Spanish had called an enchantment was now a flat expanse of rubble and sun-bleached bone, its canals choked with the debris of 1,000 years of culture. The victory of Hernán Cortés was a masterpiece of political and military opportunism, but it was a victory that came with a price tag that history is still calculating. The immediate aftermath was a period of dark, unmitigated tragedy. The survivors of the siege, gaunt, traumatized, and riddled with disease, were marched out of the ruins of their city. The Spanish, their initial religious fervor, now replaced by an insatiable, frustrated lust for the gold they had lost during the Noche Triste, subjected the Aztec nobility to horrific tortures. Cuauhtémoc himself had his feet burned with oil in a vain attempt to make him reveal the location of the hidden treasury. He never broke, and years later, Cortés would have him hanged on a remote expedition, a final, ignominious end for the last Huey Tlatoani. But the physical destruction of the empire was merely the preamble to a larger, biological catastrophe. The silent ally, smallpox, was followed by waves of other Old World diseases, measles, influenza, and the mysterious coccolistly hemorrhagic fever. Within a century of the conquest, the indigenous population of central Mexico had plummeted from an estimated 25 million to fewer than 1 million. It was a demographic collapse without precedent, a hollowing out of a continent that paved the way for the total imposition of Spanish rule. From the ruins of Tenochtitlan, Cortés began the construction of a new capital, Mexico City. It was a symbolic act of architectural colonization. The stones of the Great Temple were used to build the Metropolitan Cathedral. The palaces of the Aztec lords became the foundations for Spanish mansions. The canals were filled in to make way for horses and wagons. The floating city was transformed into a terrestrial one, a Spanish grid stamped onto the heart of the New World. The gods of the Aztecs, Huitzilopochtli and Quetzalcoatl, were driven underground, their statues smashed and buried, replaced by the icons of the Catholic Church. The legacy of the conquest is a complex and deeply contested territory. To the Spanish of the time, it was a glorious crusade, a triumph of the true faith over a blood-soaked paganism. Cortés became a legendary figure, the model for the great man theory of history, a visionary who had added a vast and wealthy new continent to the empire of Charles V. But to the modern world, the conquest is seen through a much darker lens. It is the foundational event of European colonialism in the Americas, a story of genocide, cultural erasure, and the birth of a new mestizo identity forged in the fires of trauma. The fall of the Aztecs proved that a small, technologically advanced, and utterly ruthless force could topple a massive empire if it knew how to exploit the internal cracks of its enemy. It was won not just by Spanish steel, but by the thousands of Tlaxcalan and Texcocan allies who saw the Spanish as a way to escape Aztec tyranny, only to find themselves under a new, even more pervasive form of imperial control. It was a victory won by Malintzин's linguistic bridge, by Cortés's tactical genius, and by the microscopic warriors of the smallpox virus. Today, as you walk the streets of modern Mexico City, the ghosts of the conquest are everywhere. You can see them in the ruins of the Templo Mayor, sitting silently next to the colonial cathedral. You can see them in the faces of the people, a living blend of the two worlds that collided so violently in 1519. At the Plaza of the Three Cultures in Tlatelolco, a stone plaque marks the spot where the empire finally fell. Its words serve as the most fitting epitaph for the story. On August 13th, 1521, heroically defended by Cuauhtémoc, Tlatelolco fell to the power of Hernán Cortés. It was neither a triumph nor a defeat. It was the painful birth of the mestizo nation that is Mexico today. The fifth sun did not set. It was eclipsed by a new world. The story of the fall of the Aztecs is a reminder that history is not a gentle stream, but a violent collision of forces, a process of brutal destruction and chaotic creation. It is the story of how 500 men, driven by gold and God, changed the map of the planet forever, leaving behind a legacy of gold and blood that still defines the world we live in today.